People know that you're joining us from India. So we really appreciate your doing this for us.
No, I think it's a convenient time for me. It's more difficult for you all. It's early morning. For me, it's a reasonably good time, 7:30 in the evening. So it's very fine.
Not so early here. Are you in Delhi right now, or you're up?
Yes, I'm in Delhi.
Okay, well, maybe we should start now. So hello and welcome to our series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering, perspectives from around the world. To those of you who are returning, we're happy to see you again. And for those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. I am Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Alanson White Institute of Psychoanalysis, Psychiatry, and Psychology. In January, we opened our series with views on racism and discrimination in the United States. In the following months, we heard perspectives from Palestine, Mexico, Russia, and South America. We also learned about the role of museums in influencing culture through their exhibits on the history of racism in the United States. Today, we will continue our series with Dr. Honey OBEROI VAHALI and the Tibetan Sino story. Before I introduce our guest speakers today, I would like to thank members of the Institute's administration who support our series: Kenneth Isold, Elizabeth Krimendahl, Richard Herman, John Aumann, and Elizabeth Rodman. I would also like to acknowledge the work of the members of my committee. They have created our program, invited our speakers, and are the moderators for our events. My committees include Karen Gennaro, Anton Hart, Tom Hennis, Gurmeet Kanwal, Catherine Nordzi, Vladin Novakovich, Jean Petrucelli, Hopton Shaw, David Solomon, Masato Tsujikawa, and Cleone White. To all of you, thank you. I would like to extend a special welcome to our participants from around the globe. Today, we have people joining us from Australia, Portugal, Russia, Mexico, Greece, Japan, Germany, the UK, India, Taiwan, Belarus, Israel, Iran, Vietnam, Romania, and of course, many from the United States. I also want to thank everyone who submitted questions for our speakers. We will try to address as many as possible during our meeting. And during our meeting, you may also add questions today using the Q&A button, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator today is Dr. Gurmeet Kanwal. Dr. Kanwal is Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the William Alanson White Institute. He is past president of the William Alanson White Psychoanalytic Society and an editorial board member and fellow of the College of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis and the editorial board member, Psychoanalytic Discourse. Dr. Kanwal is co-editor with Salman Akhtar of the books Bereavement, Personal Experiences, and Clinical Reflections, and Intimacy, Clinical, Cultural, Digital, and Developmental Perspectives. His papers have been published in Contemporary Psychoanalysis, Neuropsychoanalysis, Psychoanalytic Review, and Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Society. His most recent publication is More Than Simply Human: Intersectionality in Psychoanalytic Theory, Practice, and Establishment in the current issue of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. In addition to teaching in the United States, Dr. Kanwal has also lectured on psychoanalysis in India and Iran. So I'll now turn the program over to Dr. Kanwal, who will introduce our speaker today, Dr. Honey OBEROI VAHALI. Gurmeet, you need to unmute yourself.
That's always the case. Okay. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, everyone who is here, and welcome from around the world. So the last time I was moderating this series was back in February of 2021, and I couldn't have imagined that we would still be so deeply in this pandemic, moving through surge after surge around the world. But unfortunately, the part that is not so surprising is that even in a pandemic of this magnitude, the forces of inequity, marginalization, racism, and power politics that we are trying to address in these series are continuing to determine who gets vaccinated and who doesn't, who lives and who dies. I also could not have imagined then that once again we would be watching the utter indifference, hubris, and inhumanity of US politics playing out on the world stage, now in the abandonment of the people of Afghanistan and the recent death of 7 young children from the Hellfire missile unleashed by a lifeless drone. In this context, it gives me particularly great pleasure to welcome Dr. Honey OBEROI VAHALI, whose intense personal humanity, as well as the deep humanity embedded in her ideas, is just what we need to reflect on. Dr. VAHALI is a psychoanalyst and professor of psychology at the School of Human Studies at Ambedkar University in Delhi, India. She has a particular interest in exploring the social roots of emotional suffering. She is also interested in forging bridges between psychoanalysis, spirituality, and models of social justice. She has been thinking and working on establishing a socially sensitive model of psychotherapy of relevance to the Indian context. She has been writing on these subjects as well as on refugees, the practice of psychotherapy, the history of insanity, and that of psychoanalysis in India. Her first major research work was on the Tibetans in exile. Using a psychoanalytic sensibility, she explored the inner world of 3 generations of Tibetans living in India, and she has also worked extensively with Tibetan torture survivors. In this work, she has tried to see how culture and psyche are interrelated and how Buddhism functioned as a creative force in enabling the Tibetans to work through their losses that displacement and refugeehood had imposed upon them. Her book, Lives in Exile, Exploring the Inner World of Tibetan Refugees, is an exposition to this effect. In 2019, she edited a book on critical and empathetic pedagogy, a song called Teaching, Ebbs and Flows of Empathetic and Experiential Pedagogies. And presently, she is writing on psychoanalytic psychotherapy and the mother-daughter relationship. She is also the founding director of the Center of Psychotherapy and Clinical Research and was the Dean, School of Human Studies, Ambedkar University in Delhi. Honey, I'm so pleased and honored to welcome you and looking forward to hearing your wonderful thoughts. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, Gurmeet? Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And let me say this, that this is really a privilege and honor for me to participate in this series of talks on race, discrimination, and othering, organized by the Technology and Global Learning Committee at the William Allison White Institute. I thank all of you, in particular yourself and Dr. Maria, for making it possible for me to share my thoughts in this important initiative, which I believe seeks to address a historically neglected link in mainstream psychoanalytic scholarship and practice. With its privileging of the inner world, psychoanalysis in the past has missed attending in a fuller manner to contextual realities. which powerfully determine and create the flows of the unconscious and human subjectivity. Keeping race, discrimination, and othering at the center gives us a chance to engage with socio-political potential of psychoanalytic thinking and practice, given its ethos of in-depth, prolonged, and humane engagement. In the face of rising capitalism and the commodification of everything, including human feelings, psychoanalysis stands as a valuable force, honoring slowness and human suffering. At this level, it situates itself as a significant counterforce, resisting currents that justify social and economic dehumanization. However, at another level, by ignoring the deeper inroads that injustice, racism, hypernationalism, ableism, class and caste-related othering, among others, makes into the human psyche, psychoanalysis in its mainstream rendition may lose out on crucial insights vis-a-vis the psyche of the marginalized, displaced, non-normatively situated and oppressed people. Unwittingly, it stands at danger of colliding with the powers that be. It is in this context that I believe that this ongoing dialogue assumes such an importance. In an unjust world, this initiative of the William Allison White Institute, along with some, yes.
I'm sorry, may I just interrupt you for a second? It seems that you have a fan on, and the fan seems to be interfering a bit with the audio. So is it possible to turn it off? Would it be too hot?
Yes, I've switched it off.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So could you hear me, or
yes.
So I believe that this initiative of your institute really helps us to explore the potential of psychodynamic work and the contributions it can make to forms of non-retributive and transformative justice. So when I first received this invitation to this talk, I went through several ideas in my mind as to what I could talk about. The first thing that I thought about was of sharing with you about the age-old caste system in India and how it has created a division between people who are considered as chaste and pure and others who are considered as impure, disgusting, and the untouchables. And the angst that this has led for the ones who are considered as outcasts in society. At some levels, the Indian caste system parallels racism in the West, and at some levels it is different. But I have left that story for another day. My second thought was to talk about Muslims and the global rise of Islamophobia and how we have converted the Muslim into an other who has to bear the weight of our unconscious projections when we do not acknowledge our violence, our hatred within ourselves, and the Muslim becomes that projective symbol of violence and othering. At this front, I was thinking about talking about, the Indian Muslims who had believed at the time of 1947, when the subcontinent had been partitioned into India and Pakistan, they had stayed back, believing that this was their country, and how today they occupy a very marginal space in the Indian politic, which is actually in line with the global othering of Muslims all across the world. The third thought that I had was to talk about, the othering that patriarchy has led to in the world at large, also in South Asia and India, where women's lives have been from the birth of a woman to her, when her birth is considered as undesirable, and there is so much of female infanticide, to the plight of widows. This is another unending story of discrimination and othering, and I hope that this will also be taken up at some time in your series of talks. And yet, after all of this, I thought that for today, I would like to talk about the Chinese Tibetan story, because I feel that this is a very unique story of holding on to non-violence in the face of most of the world turning more and more fascist and totalitarian. I think a democracy is on the decline, and in most places there are forms of hyper masculine nationalism which have curtailed spaces of free speech, free dialogue, and exchange of ideas. Versions of truth are narrowing down to one singular version. Within this context, I thought that Tibet represents a very different reality, where in a world where today's victim becomes tomorrow's victimizer, Tibet has held on to a very different stance in its movement of freedom for the last over 60 years. Another reason which guided my choice to talk about China and Tibet today was that I think that this is a story which is very less known in most parts of the world. And there has been a total silence on the question of Tibet, actually not only Tibet, East Turkestan, Inner Mongolia, and several other colonies of China. I do believe we have spoken, while we have not been able to do much reparative work, but we have still spoken about the Holocaust. We have been speaking about anti-racism. We have been speaking about anti-apartheid movements. We have been speaking about anti-caste movements. But the condition of people who are at present the colonies, colonized by China, this has not been spoken about at all. And it is sad that despite the fact that the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, and at some levels we like to hear his lectures and talk about him, and especially America is a host to a lot of Dalai Lama's lectures. But as far as the world is concerned, not a single country of the world has taken a political position on Tibet. Neither the UN, nor India, nor any other country. Yeah? So this is, and the story of Tibet and East Turkestan is one of the most brutal genocides of the 20th century, which is hardly spoken about, discussed, or even deliberated upon as to what is the way forward for people who are living in such circumstances. So this was another reason why I thought of acquainting ourselves with this important story of Tibet. At another level, I do firmly believe that the Tibetan movement is a history in making. It is a history in making of how generation after generation of people are holding on to non-violence in the face of violent onslaught of their identity. Yeah. So, these are some of the reasons why I bring to you this narrative today. And let me just take a moment. Gurmeet, if you would not like to intervene here, or if you would like to intervene and say something, I can take on from there. Or should I go on to the context of Tibet? Yeah.
Please go on. Yeah, it's fascinating, what you're describing, and it would be great to hear some of the history and background of how this has developed.
So, one other thing I would like to add is that talking about Tibet actually also provides us with an opportunity to reflect on what has happened to the great egalitarian philosophies of the West, of the left, because when Mao took over China in 1949 and Tibet was taken over a decade later in 1959, the aspiration of the Chinese was really to bring an end to serfdom and to bring about an end to feudalism and to liberate the people. So there was a sincerity of motivation. And yet when the means and the ends did not match one another, we see that a human disaster actually took place. I say all of this with a lot of sadness because I myself have very close allegiance and respect for the left I continue to have that respect. And yet, if time will permit, at the end of this talk, I would like to say something about my understanding and that of other scholars on China and Tibet as to why an inversion of ideals took place in the Chinese context. However, today, China is not the same. It is not the same China as of 1949 or 1959. Today, it has become a mega capitalist power, a huge nuclear power, and an economic giant. And perhaps no country of the world really wants to take differences with China. This also becomes one of the reasons why Tibet, East Turkestan remains so much in the shadows and are not spoken about. So coming to I just have some images which I would like to share with you. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay, so so this is by way of showing you the manner in which most of the Tibetans have continued to demonstrate very peacefully with candlelight marches whenever there are atrocities which take place inside of Tibet. Yeah, so talking about the Chinese takeover of Tibet, in 1949, communism came to China. But for 10 years, the communists were concerned about, making an impression with the Tibetan people. But in 1959, after a tussle which involved a threat to the life of the 24-year-old Dalai Lama at that time, the Dalai Lama, along with about 1 lakh people in the next couple of years, made a heroic escape into India. Yeah. So Tibet got taken.
For those who might not be familiar with 1 lakh, that's 100,000 people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So 100,000 people. That's right. Made escaped into India, and India did provide. Jawaharlal Nehru was the then Prime Minister of India, and they provided asylum to the Tibetan leader and the people of Tibet, but it was not possible. India had itself just attained its independence from British, and it was not possible for them to in any way interfere as such and take a political position on Tibet. However, the exiled Tibetan leader has lived in India in Dharamshala since 1959 onwards. And since then, his country has suffered both ways. One is the trials of Tibetans who have lived as refugees and who have continued to live in circumstances of uprootedness. And I will be talking more about this in a while. And the other has been the difficulty that the Tibetan people have continued to experience, those who stayed back inside Tibet. So just also to give you an idea, the total Tibetan population was somewhere around 6 million, around 6 million, and out of which about 100,000 people escaped into exile. The rest of them continued to live inside Tibet under very difficult circumstances. And also, I think the point is that Tibet was a very isolated country up till 1959. So to imagine Tibet is very different than, say, imagining Germany, imagining Russia, imagining Poland. And I would like to read for you a statement that one of the Tibetan writer whom I had an occasion to talk with said when he expressed about the tragedy of his country. So he says, and I quote, he says, "For us, it has been different than for any other oppressed groups. The Germans and the Jews were existing in the same time-space continuum, but for us, 200 years of life and history were condensed in a single moment of takeover and expulsion. Till then, Tibet was existing in a totally different time-space continuum. The point is that nowhere else in the world has a repressive system created as much psychological confusion as in China. At least in Nazi Germany, it was clear that the enemy was Hitler. A clear line divided them from us. The Gestapo was the symbol of the killings. One knew one's victimizer. In Russia too, it was the same. There was the KGB and the NKB. They beat and killed the liberals, the writers and the poets. But in China, under thought reform and the Cultural Revolution, there was total confusion. The killings were not to be done by the government, but by one's own children, students, relatives, and friends. There has been no systematic study of the psychological aftermath of Chinese communism in China and Tibet. However, if there were to be one, the extent of the damage it revealed would be astonishing. When I visited Tibet, I felt that the people there were always ready to break down and cry. This is Jamyang Norbo. He is a very well-known Tibetan writer, now settled in the US. This is an image I would like to share, a historical image of the Dalai Lama along with his followers on horses making an escape from Tibet in 1959. The next slide, if you see, this is again an image from early 1960s of how Norbo talks about his people. You know, you can look at the stunned expressions on their faces as they are making escape from their homeland and arriving into India with whatever belongings. So the altitude was very different in Tibet. The climate was very different. For them to adjust in the plains of India was a horrendous story in itself. I will just take you to a map of Tibet. If you can see this map. Is it visible, Gurmeet, the map? Yeah. So if you see this area in purple, this is a map of China. And this area, this entire area in purple is what are the different provinces of Tibet. It consists of three main provinces of Eastern Tibet, Central and Western Tibet. And actually, if one were to think about the entire size of Tibet is astonishing. It is 2.5 million square kilometers, which is equivalent to the entire size of Europe. Whole of Europe fits into one country, Tibet. Yeah, and then you can see these areas in yellow, which are the areas of East Turkestan, which is also colonized by China. And East Turkestan constitutes about 1.6 million square kilometers. So, and then you can see Inner Mongolia, which is now a colony of China again. So if you just look at East Turkestan and Tibet put together, the area that they constitute to the Chinese mainland is about 42%, and the population that they give to China is 3%. Yeah, so 3% population of the people and 42% of their geographical territory, which means that the exploitation of the mineral resources, the exploitation of the land, and the ecosystem of Tibet, which was a huge forest density, has been totally devastated now, and it has become a zone of nuclear testing. This is so ironically in opposition to the wishes of the Dalai Lama, who believed that his country should have no army and it should just, stand as a buffer between the great rival powers of Asia, between India and China. And he believed that there would be no soldiers, there would be no army in Tibet. And today Tibet has become one of the biggest nuclear testing zones of the world. So the point here that I'm trying to make is that a people and the culture has been taken over completely. And in this takeover of the people, to give you another idea about what has been the situation of the Tibetan genocide is, out of 6 million people, 1.2 million, that is almost 1/5, you can say 1 out of every 5 people has been killed in Tibet. So 1.2 million people have been killed in Chinese prisons. 18,000 revolting nuns and monks have fled into exile because they are the ones who are, really taking on the cause of Tibet. Because the freedom of expression of voice is extremely limited, according to several human rights reports, including the Amnesty International. Tibet and East Turkestan constitute 2 of the most repressed places in the entire world, where freedom has been curtailed to that extent. Yeah? So now I would also like to mention this, that there have been different phases in this takeover of Tibet's history. For instance, between 1960s to 1970s, from 1962 to 1976, about 40 million people were killed in China, including a substantive portion within Tibet due to the experiments that were done in agriculture and thought reform. 2 of the most notable ones were the Great Leap Forward and the Great Chinese Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was an attempt to do away with all past traditions, all past ways of working, belief systems. So Tibet had a very rich heritage of Buddhism, and it had about 6,000 monasteries. All 6,000 monasteries were destroyed. People were not given the right to practice their religion. People were not given the right to speak in their language, wear their dress code, etc., etc. So all of these are, you can just get an idea about how people must have survived during this time. And these were people who lived, as I said earlier, in a different time space. Their religious symbols were used as stones to build toilets, and they were forced to walk upon them. So this was considered to be as a way of ushering in a new order, a more progressive order where serfdom and feudalism in China and Tibet would be done away with. What was very peculiar about this part was also this, that it was the younger generation that was used to execute the older generation. So, if it was a lama or if it was a religious person, the person's own disciples had to be his or her executors. Or if it was a father, the son had to shoot or kill one's own father. So you can imagine the extent of psychological trauma that all of this must have led to. And in some sense, this has become part of the unspeakable agonies of the people of Tibet. They cannot go into this. They cannot articulate guilt. They cannot articulate feelings about this. These are very little spoken stories in the Tibetan narrative. Similar is also the story of East Turkestan or of the Uyghur people today. So in some sense, there was a systematic rewriting of the history of Tibet that several generations in occupied the problem that came about in Tibet was, while we know that in the Holocaust too, people were not able to talk to their children about what they had undergone. But in Tibet, the peculiarity was that people could not talk to their children because of the fear of threat of the agencies, the surveillance systems. And so the relationship between the generations was broken down. And a huge veil of silence disconnected one generation from the other generation. So you are living in the same house, but you don't really know. Of course, the unconscious knows, and they could know via means which were beyond conscious knowing. They sensed it. There was a palpable transmission of intergenerational trauma via the feeling levels, but they could not talk about what a parent had undergone to what the child's was, because the entire system of trust was broken down for them. So also I would like to say, yes, Gurmeet?
I was just thinking, you're talking about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, but you're also pointing out that even within the intergenerational transmission of trauma as a general category, there can be differences in how it is happening in one place versus another, that there is something particular about this context, how the transmission occurs here as opposed to somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. So I do think, because I have looked at some of the literature from the Holocaust, and it says that how without the parent narrating the narrative, that becomes a part of the child's psyche. In Tibet also you would have access to those aspects, but what was very systematically done was that the parental generation and the generation of the children that came after them, the trust network between these two was also destroyed. So mourning in families could not take place. Yeah? So it's very distinctive. I think I agree with you, Gurmeet, that if we do a historical study of intergenerational transmission of trauma, different political contexts will bring out very, very particular aspects about it. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And here I would also like to say that today the scene of Tibet is that at a, there are also these periods when there are, so after 1976, when Mao Zedong died and they had a new person at the helm of the politics, there was a period of relative liberalization of freedoms. So religious practice could be allowed, dress could be allowed. Language has always been under the control because language also becomes a means of, ascertaining superiority. So most Tibetans are taught Chinese in their schools, and Tibetan is considered as inferior as a language. And then 1990s, 1989 onwards, again, there was, whenever there is a rise of political protest inside Tibet, curtailment of freedoms begins to take place. And in 2008, when the Beijing Olympics were taking place and Tibetans within Tibet began to protest, since then, again, there has been a lot of curb on freedoms within Tibet as well as East Turkestan. Today, in terms of population, there has been a massive population transfer in Tibet. There are about 9 million Han Chinese and 6 million Tibetans in Tibet, which makes them a minority in their own country. And also, there have been, I will go on further and talk about state torture within Tibet and what this has done to the psyche of the people. But let me here say a little bit, if Gurmeet, you think it's okay, could I go on to talk about the trauma of exiled Tibetans a little bit in terms of what has happened with them, intergenerationally speaking?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Please go on. Absolutely.
Okay, so in terms of the people who have lived in exile, they have had a different. Now there are 4 generations of Tibetans in exile, almost 4 generations, with the youngest one being somewhere between the ages of 15 to 25. But in this, what we find here is that the older generation believes that there was a way of life, and that way of life was something that they need to hold allegiance to and they need to remain loyal to. Yeah? So that coming to terms with the present, therefore, becomes a dynamic where remembering becomes like a way to holding on to the past, and forgetting feels like a betrayal. So, like several of them would give the metaphor when I would be speaking to them that it's like if you forget the past, it's like a tree that has withered. It has lost its roots, and many people could settle into the new land where they have come. But for us to remember is very, very significant, because one day we have to go back. One day we have to go back. And that's actually very reminiscent of the way in which the Jews have kept their memories intact, that next year in Palestine, next year in Jerusalem. Yeah, so that is a very important part, that to remember what has been left behind, that becomes a way of working through the present rather than adapting to the present. Because if they were to adapt, then what will they keep the movement for? Then there is no possibility of going back. So, and this also becomes an intergenerational issue, because the younger Tibetans have never seen the homeland. Especially the Tibetans in the third generation have never seen their homeland. And for them, it is all an imagined past. So the past look of the parent or the grandparent, therefore, almost becomes like that life has stopped for them somewhere, whereas we need to go onward, we need to go forward. That is not all of the third generation, but there is a section that feels like that. There is another section who remains deeply identified with the grandparents' generation. So, I would just say here that, let me just share a statement from a Tibetan person whom I had spoken about. And this is how 50 years down the line, she still remembers the way in which she had left the homeland, the circumstances in which, so they have become almost like frozen memories from there. So she says, a gushing wind was sweeping by. The chubas are the traditional dress of the Tibetans, of the dead, had blown over the faces. Removing the cloth from many, many bodies, one by one, I automatically scanned the faces to identify my father. At that time, I must have felt absolutely stoned. So if you look at the statement, there is a gushing wind, and the force of that memory comes to her still through that gushing wind. There are the sweeping chubas, columns after columns of dead bodies lying prostrate on the ground, and a stunned 12-year-old child frantically searching for a missing parent. This memory is replete with many annihilative symbols even today. It is powerful enough to evoke an overwhelming aura of stillness that signifies the breakdown of a familiar frame of reality. The passing away of a former way of life is most powerfully evoked by the witnessing eyes of a child who almost half a century later has preserved the immediacy of death through an image of a parent's generation rendered completely helpless and therefore lying still and symbolically prostrate on the blood-stained battleground. So, this power, this kind of powerful memories brings about a psychic split in the older Tibetans, where Tibet of the past becomes the space where it becomes the land of plenty, it becomes the space which nourished them, and everything in the present becomes incomparably very, very faint to what they can identify with. Another elderly Tibetan, as she speaks, she says that, and I will bring a dream. Why I'm also going back to them is because I believe that while I'm representing them, it is their words which should come up here. She says, for many years after coming from Tibet, I would repeatedly dream of my life there. But even in my dreams, I would never be reunited with my family members. In one rather frequent dream, I saw myself approaching Mount Kailash. But as I neared the sacred mountain, it covered itself with mist. Being so close by, I still couldn't see it. Yeah? So that is another trauma of not being able to access in one's own psyche fully the home that has been left behind. And like another Tibetan who says, like Tibetans, there are other refugees who have been thrown out of the land. They resettle and seek a new life elsewhere. But it is different for people like us. We don't wish to build a new life elsewhere. this has been observed. This kind of a dynamic has been observed in other historical survivors also. The need to remain, to retain fidelity to the selves that we were. Robert J. Lifton, in his study of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, too, notes it there. And in several other psychoanalytic works, it has been brought up. But if you think about it, what it also brings up is the difficulty of giving their trauma a place in history, of historicizing trauma, of putting it behind oneself, because it eludes the possibility of its symbolization. It remains as if it is ever present. It is there. So when you talk to them, initially they may say to you that why talk about themes which are of such an older time? What will we get out of talking about times which we have moved past? But when the survivor begins to talk, you can see the power and intensity in the speech. It is as if the trauma is taking place right now. Yeah? So the trauma doesn't become post, it remains part of the present, it pervades the present. Then if I were to come and I were to talk about, Gurmeet, anything you would like to say here, or you would like to
stop? A lot about what you're saying about memory and so on, but let's go on and we will come back, when we have some time to some of these points you're making. They're fascinating to me, but please do go on.
So this is an image that I'm sharing with you by a Tibetan artist. This is his painting. The artist's name is Karma Seche. And when I asked him what this painting was about, he called it formation. And he said it is formation because the refugee's trauma, being an exile, and the refugee's trauma is so deep that you feel that you don't have a containing base, And I think Nancy Carlo Orlando's studies in Latin America also talk about very similar dynamics in refugees. So he has drawn this as a womb. So he says that the vulnerability that the refugee suffers is that you feel as if you don't have a protection around you. And that protection, you are the one who has to create your own womb, that vulnerable base of your emotional life. So I just thought of sharing and bringing it up with all of you. Let me just talk a little bit now about the second generation of people who were exiled. This is an image again from early 1960s, courtesy of the Tibetan archives, from where I have taken this photograph. And you can see, I'm sorry, my image is not placed that well, but if I were able to go below a little bit, they're all little children. Yeah, they're little children of 3, 4, 5 who were at the time when their parents fled, they were also accompanying their parents. And this is an image when they arrive in India at Dharamshala, which was to thereafter be their home. Now, this is a second generation which has tried to remain positive between the generation of its parents and the generation of its children. And as most second generations are, they are the ones who have to make sense of the parental trauma while also create hope for the generation of the children. Yeah? Most of the people of this generation actually grew up in what is called as Tibetan children's villages, because most of them had lost their parents during transit or in the harsh conditions of exile after coming back, or several of them parents were executed before they had fled Tibet. So the exile community created what was called foster homes. And I do think that this is another space of deeper study of how an entire generation has been brought up by women who themselves had lost their children in transit or otherwise, and they became the foster mothers of these children. And this generation, so this is a very unique experiment in the Tibetan context about how many of them have become writers, they have become poets, they have become intellectuals. And actually, this is the generation which is in some sense the intellectual mind of Tibet, which took upon itself the task of giving place to the parental generation's sorrows and also carving a future movement that the next generation could take forward with. Yeah, so this is very, very pertinent to note the creativity of the second generation, a creativity that came up amidst the despair that they were going through. So Jamyang Norbu, whom I quoted above, is a writer from the second generation of Tibetan exiles. For the third generation of Tibetans, let me just use a poem by a Tibetan poet himself, Tenzing Sundu, and I think it says it well, how the struggle continues. So he says, when I was born, my mother said, you are a refugee. A tent on the roadside smoked in the snow. On your forehead, between your eyebrows, there is an R embossed. My teacher said, I scratched and scrubbed. On my forehead, I found a brush of red paint. I am a born refugee. So you can see how the body becomes the space in which the pain of refugeehood gets located for the poet, where he is saying that R is embossed between my eyebrows and I can never get rid of it. This is my destiny and this is my fate. And then in another poem, he goes on to say, but for how long will we go on telling our children, where did we really come from? So the struggle goes on. This is a young Tibetan protesting on the streets of Delhi, and you can see the anguish on the face. It tells it much better than what I can talk about here. So here is Tenzing Sundu, who is saying, the fences have grown into a jungle. Now, how can I tell my children where we came from? What do we go on providing as a historical link from one generation to the other? But within the third generation itself, we see that there is a lot of confusion. There is flux, there is drug abuse. The homeland is becoming more of a culture to carry along rather than a nation with geographical borders to return to. That is not being that easily kept up now, apart from the activists like Tenzing Sundu and others. Here, I would just like to bring a couple of other images to you about the situation inside Tibet now and the history of generations there. Now, this is an image, again, courtesy of the Tibet Museum and Archives, of people protesting along a sacred monastery that was rebuilt post Mao Zedong's death. And this is a very, very sacred site for the Tibetans. This is in early 1990s. Yeah? The next is an image of people who, who under a threat to their own life, but they make an escape across the Himalayas. And Tibet, we must remember, is at it is called as the roof of the world because it is at a height of about 12,000 meters above sea level. So it is really the top of the world. And these people are people who regularly escape on foot, whereas at every step they have the danger of being shot dead by the patrolling Chinese police. And they escape from Tibet into Nepal and into India then thereafter. So they are called as the new refugees or the recent refugees, and you can see the kind of tension on their faces as they are making the exit because they cannot bear the kind of circumstances. Once they have become familiar with their history, living there becomes very, very difficult for them. The next image is of Palden Gyatso. Palden Gyatso was a Tibetan monk who spent 33 years under torture, and under torture for about 7 years. His legs were shackled 1 meter was the length between the shackles between his 2 feet, and that is how he existed. And ultimately, he was a prisoner of conscience of the Amnesty International, which after 33 years was able to release him. And he was the first political prisoner from Tibet who stole the torture instruments from inside of China's prisons and demonstrated to the world at large. He is considered as a heroic figure for the Tibetans. He died in 2018, and I will just in a while speak about him a little bit more. This is Amma Ade, another her Tibetan name is Ade Tapunsang, and she is cherishably called by her people as Amma Ade, means Mother Ade. As a maternal title she is given. She spent 28 years in Tibetan prison under conditions of torture, where she was raped multiple times. 16 members of her family were executed, including her son, who was killed, and her husband and her brothers and her sisters. And the same was the story with Palden Gyatso. And the next, if I were to show you, this is Dratchi prison, which is one of the most dreaded prisons of China, where both Amma Ade and Palden Gyatso and so many other torture survivors spent years on end in their life. And you can see these are the cells in which they were kept, most of them, and the work labor, they were put to about 16 to 17 hours of labor. And as they recall in the biographies and autobiographies, that the only way that they could understand that the day was turning into night or the seasons was changing was when they felt the bitter winds of winter, hurting their limbs. So there was no freedom. There is no freedom. Why China produces so much is the question we should be asking, because most of the products from China are coming from its prison inmates. So now the story inside Tibet, if I were to go a little bit there, this is an image again by the artist Karmasuchi, in which he is showing how a Tibetan is self-emulating himself, but is smiling. Yeah? In accordance with their Buddhist ideals, they would not believe that killing another person is okay. But when the expression of anguish becomes too much, killing the self is an option that they resort to. So be it Palden Gyatso, or be it Amma Ade, or so many others, inside prison, these are people who have started revolutionary movements inside prison under conditions of torture. And most of them, by the time that I met some of them, their one cherished wish was that their biographies, their autobiographies, or their testimonies should be recorded, because they believed, there was a lot of survival guilt that they were carrying. That, for instance, Amma Ade recalled that when she had gone into the prison, there were 400 other women. And when she was released from the prison, there were 3 of them. So she believed that the purpose of her life was that it should become a testimony of the lives of others who were no longer there to tell their own stories, So that was the power with which they shared their narratives. And similar was Palden Gyatso's narrative also. Palden Gyatso was considered as a mentor by 2 generations of people after him, because he started some of the most well-known protests inside Tibet from within the prison walls. Yeah. So the more they tortured him, the more resolute he became by believing in his Buddhist ideals, that he had to not give up his sense of protest. Now, if I were to just go on to, so how have they been protesting in a non-violent manner? The manner in which they have been protesting is that they have found unique ways. For instance, whenever the Chinese government says that now you can have freedom of expression, they started a practice of lakher. Lakher means a white Wednesday. Wednesday is the day of the birth of the Dalai Lama. So they began praying for the long life of the Dalai Lama. And this is the time when the Chinese said, you have religious freedom. When the Chinese say you do not have religious freedom, none of this can be done up. So they have also understood that violent protest is not an answer, because the power in opposition is very, very strong. Non-violent protest has a much longer life. That non-violence has a much longer life than violent protest, because they can be squashed anytime if it is a violent protest as such. So very unique ways in which they have tried to protest. And what it does for them is it keeps them in touch with their own Buddhist beliefs, and it also makes it possible. I'm not trying to say that they have never protested in violent ways. There have been instances of pelting of stones, there have been destruction of Chinese property, but all of that is much less than the non-violent means of protest that the Tibetans have been adopting. Here onwards, I would just like to, Gurmeet, if I can take 10 more minutes and talk about what are the ways of reparation that the Tibetans have used. Yeah.
Yes, please. So if we can be done in about 8-10 minutes, then we can have some time for any questions people might have.
Sure. So, a statement by the Dalai Lama, who says, sometimes in the darkness of the night or in the silence of the space, the Chinese communists too must be reflecting on their action. Millions of Chinese are suppressed by their own government. We must not forget that the suffering is the same as the Tibetans. What I would like to say here is that the Dalai Lama should not be considered only as an individual. He has become like a culture or a climate for the Tibetan people, by leading his people into thinking that there is something of value in the suffering that they have gone through. He helps them to remain in touch with their own identity as truer Tibetans by becoming truer Buddhists. And at the same point of time, he is always talking to them about how violence must not be answered by counter-violence, and the potential of hatred must be acknowledged but must not be acted upon. Yeah. So that is, I think, very, very important for a political leader to be able to do this. Until early 2000s, he had a special process, which was that he would have a private audience with every torture survivor who had escaped into exile, or groups of people who had come into exile. And in that, he bore witness to the suffering, whatever they have gone through. So this would be like a 2-hour or a 2.5-hour long private audience with the Dalai Lama, in which the suffering would be witnessed, and he would acknowledge their hardships. But while they were going, he would remind them that the answer is not to combat hate with hate or violence with violence. And what is true for them is to remain true to their own Tibetan values. And if you listen to most of his discourses, there is not a denial of what the community has gone through. So, forgiveness is not based on forgetting, but forgiveness is based on remembering. Yes, so there is a remembrance of what the community has gone through, and a mourning and spaces of mourning for that, which makes the Tibetans very unique in terms of how they are taking their movement ahead. I would also like to say here is that the Dalai Lama therefore becomes like a maternal figure for them when he becomes a witnessing person to the suffering, and he becomes a paternal figure for them when he allows for, the Dalai Lama traditionally had both temporal and spiritual powers. In 2012, he gave up his political power because he said that Tibet does not need really a Dalai Lama, and Tibet should move towards a democratic system, and experimentation of democracy in exile is very important. So you can see that while the older generation reveres him like a god, the third generation has many political differences vis-a-vis him. So he becomes like a father with whom you can come back, you can have differences, you can talk about, whether the Dalai Lama's position of autonomy over Tibet and the people's position of desire, the activist position of freedom, total freedom that they are asking for. So here you can see that there are symbols that the Tibetans have built up. There are institutional spaces in which acknowledgement of rage, aggression is given a space to. I cannot say that it is perfect. I think no community is perfect, and I would not like to idealize the Tibetan struggle either. But you can see that there is a place in which newer refugees have a place to come and articulate their concerns. The splits in the community, for a long time, there was a split that whose suffering was greater, was the suffering of those who lived inside Tibet more, or the suffering of those who lived in exile. Today, you can see that there is some ways in which this has been contained by the community, because the community in exile is following what is taking place within Tibet, understanding that life there is actually much harder than whatever would be the life here. Now, I would, before I end, I would like to say 2 or 3 more things very briefly. One is that it depends on all of us, I think, that what would be the movement of Tibet. How long can a community by itself hold on to its stance if nobody recognizes the movement of the community? So they have held on to their values for 60 odd years now, but it also demands of us to see what we can do about East Turkestan, what we can do about Tibet, what we can do in East Turkestan, also about 1 million Uyghurs or Muslim people. The East Turkestani people are in Chinese prisons, which is one of the greatest workforce of China today. And at the end, I would like to say this, that there is a way in which memory is being shaped in the Tibetan movement. So in this culture of non-violence, what is important is also to not just remember the brutality that the people have gone through, but also acts of kindness vis-a-vis the Chinese guards, the doctors, or the prison mates under very dehumanizing prison conditions. In most other countries, what you find is that when we recall the past from the position of a victim. And here that position is being consciously worked through, that it is not just that the other is all bad. There is some humanization of the other as well. And this is in a way that how the philosophy of Buddhism, where the idea of the no self has become that there is a no other. Buddhism says that we need to give up the myth of a independent self, or we need to give up the myth of a self-sufficient self. So if there is no self-sufficient self, there is interdependence in life. And in that interdependence, remembrance becomes a different form of working through. And also the Buddhist stress on vulnerability, that life is actually impermanent, and vulnerability brings us closer to possibilities of seeing what we have gone through and what the other is. So in the Tibetan case, the idea about a Buddhist philosophy in a period of trial and in a period of crisis has become a living psychology for the people, with, of course, its conflicts and here and there and its differences. But I'm talking more from what are the more, how should I say, the more, the stronger shades in the movement. Yeah. And at last, I would like to say that as far as China is concerned, one needs to also understand the historicity of China in depth, because that is important to think that why some of the best experiments of egalitarianism in the world became its opposite. China itself has suffered 1700 years of foreign invasion and rule. And at the time when Mao Zedong came up, Japan had taken over large parts of China. China was being attacked by France on the one side, England on the other, Germany on the third side. And the Opium War was a great point of defeat and sorrow for China. So while China thought of moving ahead, two things got mixed with one another, the goals of socialism and that of making the nation a mighty nation. And in the goals and nationalism, when nationalism and socialism came about together, the link between means and end got disconnected from one another. And while the aims were very laudable, in its practice, this became a tragedy. On another side, we could also think that China represents that power becomes power because ultimately power is the power against death. We are trying to immortalize a revolution because lingering in our hearts is the fear of the death of the revolution. And this has very particular connotations with the long march of Mao Zedong, in which most of his companions had died. And then you can see, and Lifton has done a wonderful psychohistorical work on Mao's life and the immortalization and the need to immortalize the Chinese Revolution. So I'm just trying to say this, that while there is an inversion of ideals, but there is a historicity, and this is a tragic existential crisis that China of that time underwent. I'll stop here. And
thank you so much, Annie. That was just absolutely fascinating and informative talk. It's raised so many thoughts and questions and ideas in my mind. But I want to just start by putting one question that has come up from the audience. Someone is asking if you can say something about the parallel between India's history of nonviolent protests against the British and the nonviolent protests by Tibetans.
Yeah, actually the Dalai Lama takes Mahatma Gandhi or M.K. Gandhi as his mentor. Yeah? So India's, so very much, I think one, the Dalai Lama is situated in India, and the second, he seeks his roots from Gandhi's methods of protest as well. So the difference, I would say, is that Gandhi, because Gandhi was existing in his own country, Gandhi had in some sense the possibility of more direct protest. Satyagraha was a much more, a non-violent militant way of protesting was possible for Gandhi because he was sitting in his own country. Whereas for the Tibetan leader, he is an exiled leader. Yeah? So I think that is also a point I would like to make, that as an exiled leader, he has always to be cautious about what is his purview, what will be taken up from his political statements, what will they be made of from the country which is giving him asylum. But many things, if you see of the Tibetan protests, especially post 2008 onwards, you will find huge parallels between Satyagraha in India and Satyagraha-like movements that are taking place inside Tibet at present, where there is no confrontation as such, but all that they are saying is that we are returning back to our own cultural roots. You say that we have the freedom of religion and the freedom of culture, so we will practice our own ways of life. So that is taken very much from Gandhi, and a lot of Tibetan activists would also be happy to acknowledge this part.
I was also wondering, Honey, you had said in the very beginning that no country has really taken a position about China and Tibet, including India, you said. And, it makes me think that the place where one is exiled, in this case, the Tibetans are in exile in India. But in some ways, would it be right to say that India itself is an ambivalent host? And how that ambivalence in India might impact the exile experience of the Tibetan refugees?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you, Gurmeet, that India is an ambivalent host. And I think what India has been able to do for the Tibetan exiles is that it has been able to provide land and space at that point of time so that educational system and other things could come up. But India could never, because India and China are itself always under threat with one another, India has not taken a position on Tibet as such. The other sad thing, I think, in India has been that the Indian left is not at all, open to see what has been taking place in China, because it asks for a painful reflection on their own ideals. So the progressive forces in India have as if turned a real blind eye to Tibet, which leaves right-wing politics the only politics where some support for Tibet could come about. Yeah. And an exiled group of people need support whichever way it is coming from, the left or the right, because that is very, very contingent upon their own survival. So India has been definitely an ambivalent host at the political level, and even in terms of the acceptance of the Tibetan people by the Indian people, that is another point of sorrow. I don't think there has ever been a serious engagement with the issue of Tibet in India. Well, Indians could say that our own problems are so much, we have so much of poverty, class discrimination, caste, etc. Our hands are full with our own problems. But still, I feel that there is an ignorance, or at best, a seemingly benevolent tolerance with underlying shades of conflict. And also envy, I would think, that the Indians have had vis-a-vis the Tibetans. And this was my experience, especially in Dharamshala, where, who are doing better business-wise is the Tibetans than the Indians. And every now and then, there is an eruption of some form of violence or the other. The incidents are far and few, but it is not as if it is not there. So either there is a way of ignoring that another community lives along with us, or there is envy for why they have, some degree, why do the people have more of Western sponsors on an individual level? And politically speaking, there has been a good amount of ambivalence. Saddest, I would think, is the denial of the Indian left on the question of what has taken place by the left in China.
Thank you. I was also wondering if you could say a little more about this very, very interesting concept that you brought up, that the Buddhist influence on the way that the Tibetans are protesting has to do with working through their hatred in the context of a philosophy where there is no self and therefore no other or othering. What then, can you say more about that? What happens to the hatred? Or is this a successful way of working through, and can it be something that can be seen as having relevance in other contexts as well? But it's a fascinating notion that psychologically one can exist in that space where one is, suppressed and attacked, and the response and working through of the feelings about that are happening through the experience of no self and no other. I don't know what actually happens then.
So, Gurmeet, I think this will be a long, this will require a long answer, but briefly, if I were to say, you see, in the Buddhist idea, there is an experiential self, the self through which we experience our world and which we live our life on a day-to-day basis. But according to Mahayana Buddhism, there is no self that stands by itself, that is self-sufficient, and that is independent in its nature. So all phenomena of the world are interdependent on the one side and empty of inherent existence on the other side. So now I am not claiming to say that this is a practice that everybody is following within Buddhism, but I am suggesting that how a philosophy where if there is no self, which is like, I'm not a solid self, I have an experiential self, but I'm not a solid entity in myself, that gets worked through into the fact that there is neither like me, the other is also not like a solid, immutable, unchanging other. Yeah. So that is why the slide that I showed, in which the Dalai Lama says that, that that the Chinese too must be introspecting at some time, and we must not forget that a lot of Chinese people have suffered like the Tibetans there. So that is a way of reworking the self-other polarity. Yeah. So one, that the other is not somebody who can be defined only as one's torturer, one's persecutor. There are shades in the other. Yeah. So bringing into memory the shades of the other. For instance, as I said earlier, it is very pertinent that most of the torture survivors would on their own spontaneously talk about acts of kindness vis-a-vis that the Chinese did on them under conditions where survival was very, very difficult. Yeah. So there is a spectrum in which the other is seen, rather than the other is the hated Chinese, yeah, and the self is the victimized Tibetan. The second thing by way of which is that it tries to work by bringing in a Buddhist philosophy is that if, suffering is valuable in Buddhism, because all life is understood as based on suffering, and the purpose of existence is to find ways of grappling with this suffering, and there are ways out if we have the correct temperament. So in most of the discourses of the Dalai Lama, as well as the Tibetan torture survivors, for instance, I recall this, that I was having an interview with the with the private physician of His Holiness many years back, I mean about 10 years back, and now he has passed on. And in the interview, when I asked him, what was most difficult for you in the moment? So he said that what was most difficult moment for me was, and this was at Micloid in Main Sikhang, that is the Tibetan Medical College in Dharamshala. He said that there were times when I felt I could almost hate, I was so full of hatred for my tormentor. And that became the most difficult moment for me to bear. And I tried to contain that moment with my most rigorous forms of Buddhist meditation. Yeah. So I think when he came into exile, what takes place is that there is a renewal of identity. The Dalai Lama tells them at that point of time that this suffering is very, very real. Yeah. But is there another way to take the torturer? If you are in touch with your own principles, then maybe the torturer is a teacher, because he is the one who teaches you to bear your patience the most. So while this is at the conscious level, at the cultural front, it begins to have some impact. Of course, the rage and the hate does not go away. I don't think that would be humanly possible for it to go away. But, but it becomes important that the victim discourse doesn't become the most powerful one, or the memorization of the past does not take place only through an emphasis on what Dharmic Walken calls as chosen traumas, that the traumas are all coming from the outsider and inflicted upon them. And therefore, the exiled community has been able to use this period as a way of rethinking to some extent about what was wrong with itself, that the Chinese took over. And so, there would be many shades in the way that this would come up. It's not a... Yeah.
Thank you, honey. We are pretty much out of time. There are other questions, but I think we'll have to leave it there for today. That was a fascinating talk, and I'm really grateful and thankful to you for giving us this opportunity. Maria, did you want to?
Yes, it's unfortunate that we're reaching a time boundary because more questions are coming in, as well as comments between parallels, for example, with communism in Cuba. So I know you've stimulated a very rich conversation to go forward, and I want to thank you for your riveting presentation and highlighting persecution, discrimination that most of us do not know about. So to highlight this for us is really so important. And I also wanted to thank you for the suggestion for a future topic of the female infanticide. So we do have space for the future, and we may come back to you about that. So thank you for that too. And so to our audience, I want to say thank you for joining us today. And also, if you've missed any of our previous webinars, and for your friends who may have missed this one, the recordings are available on the Institute's YouTube channel. I would also like to mention that our next meeting will be on October 9th during the weekend leading up to the Indigenous Peoples Day. Our guest will be Michelle Good, who is a Cree writer, lawyer, and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. Her poems, short stories, and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies across Canada, and her poetry was included on 2 lists of the best Canadian poetry in 2016 and 2017. Her novel, 5 Little Indians, won the HarperCollins UBC Best New Fiction Prize. Michelle Good will offer her perspective on the consequences of Canadian and broader North American relations with First Nations, focusing particularly on the traumas inflicted by residential schools on Indigenous children, their families, and their communities, and also on the ways people have found to recover their lives and their cultures. We appreciate your participation and hope to see you again in October as we continue our series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering perspectives from around the world. And we hope you will all be safe and well. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Gurmeet, and thank you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, honey, and thank you, Gurmeet. Thank you.